Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Me SaaS. Really appreciate you turning out today. We've been working through some scheduling challenges here a little bit on our side, so trying to get into our regular groove again. But really appreciate you turning out for another episode. And obviously today I'm joined by the usual cast here. Bill, Toby, you guys want to raise your hand, say hello?
Hey.
There we go. And by the way, in honor of trying to mix things up today, I actually wore something other than a blue or a black polo. I want everybody to recognize that as a real effort for me to get out of my my comfort zone. Well, and today's topic, we're going to be looking at something that's kind of near and dear to my heart, and a topic that that we talk to SaaS customers and partners about all the time, which is this notion of metrics. And it's one of those things where I think everybody, when they think about metrics, they're always sort of acknowledge the value and the importance. And yes, I'm going to get metrics, and metrics are important to my environment and so on. But what we see across SaaS solutions is that as much as there's sort of this acknowledgement that metrics are important, we don't really see necessarily a whole lot of people like digging in and really like going all in and necessarily having all the metrics that we think are pretty important to them. And specifically today for this topic, we're not going to just sort of open the entire universe of everything metrics in SaaS. That's too big of a space. And actually sort of a whole lot of that SaaS metric space has a huge business sort of intersection, ARR and MRR and churn and all these other things. We're not going to sort of touch that business dimension of this problem today. Our focus today is squarely on like what metrics as an architect like that do I need to be thinking about, right? What are the things that when I design and architect and build my system, like what are the things I'll have my finger on the pulse of, and what kind of things should I be instrumenting into that environment? So I have a really good view of what my system is doing, how it's behaving under load, how it's scaling, how it's doing all the things we need it to do to be a really effective multi-tenant system. And I think for me, that is the scope of our conversation today, right? So it's like, hopefully when we get through this exercise, you'll have a better sense of maybe what metrics you ought to care about, and generally why they're maybe a little more important in SaaS environments. And I guess maybe that's what I kind of want to pivot to a little bit is I think metrics, you could have any conversation about metrics in a general architecture discussion, but we're here through the lens of SaaS. What is it about SaaS that is sort of maybe uniquely SaaS about metrics? Why? And maybe Bill, I'll just sort of throw it your way. And what is it when you talk to customers that you feel like is somehow different about the metrics discussion or additive about the metrics discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything in SaaS is always going to start with tenancy, right? So the first thing we really dive into with customers is making sure that tenancy is injected into all of their metrics, all of their logging, all of their tracing downstream. So that's sort of the baseline. It gets a lot more interesting from there. And I think we're going to start to dive into a lot of the side topics about why the processes of building a SaaS solution involve more metrics and more observability. And I need to really get a lot broader in your thinking about how your development cycle is reflected in your production environments and how you create that feedback loop. But yeah, as a starting point, you get the tenancy injected into there, and then start thinking about all your processes, right, which are going to be a lot more interesting in a SaaS solution.
Yeah, I mean, Toby, you've kind of dabbled in SaaS before. You were at AWS to some degree. Maybe there's a before and an after version of you, like since there's what you might have done before you were here and what you might do today, given maybe a little more exposure to some of the best practices of SaaS. Is there anything now that you think as a SaaS architect, like I would absolutely want more visibility for these particular reasons or these particular higher level, not necessarily which piece of data you'd want, but what things you'd be wanting to think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of goes back to a show I think we did before, which was like the control plane versus data plane, right? So paying attention to that control plane up front, making sure that you're feeding it with good information to inform your business decisions, or maybe the way how your architecture is holding up, noisy neighbors, all of that classic kind of multi-tenant stuff. But that stuff that having gone through this before and not having paid attention to that, certainly, in the category of wish I would have.
Yeah. So for me, the thing that is sort of obvious but uniquely SaaS as it relates to metrics for me is this idea that, okay, I'm like in a lot of SaaS environments, not always, but in a lot of SaaS environments, you are running a true multi-tenant infrastructure, which means you're sharing resources, you're sharing compute, you're sharing storage, potentially sharing any number of different infrastructure resources. You've got new tenants who are potentially onboarding, and that's just happening sort of potentially outside of your view, and that's just coming in and they're consuming your system in new ways potentially that they other tenants didn't consume it before. And for me, if I just said, look at log files, like what's going on in the logs, or what's going on in that, like a classic sort of data I have about how my system's being used, I really couldn't tell you a whole lot about the important sort of dimensions of that problem, like which tenants are actually consuming the system and in which patterns, right? And how is the system responding when those tenants hit the system in that way? And are we scaling the way we should be scaling? Are we and can we somehow proactively have a view into what's happening? Because imagine, like, if our system goes down, obviously in a multi-tenant SaaS environment, that can mean all my customers are down. Like, so this for me at least is the roots of the metrics. I both want to know kind of what's going on, just because I want to know what's going on, because I feel like it informs the next thing I might do, or how I might evolve my architecture. But it also gives me a view into things that could be going wrong that I don't know are going wrong. Because in a shared infrastructure model, if I'm only looking at, hey, the compute was consumed X amount today, it may look like the system was entirely healthy, but oh, by the way, 6 of my tenants had a really bad experience because some way they were exercising the system produced a bad experience for them, right? So for me, at least, that's how I look at it. I don't know, does that fit with how you guys think about it?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. You just used a lot more words to basically say what I was trying to say.
I always use a lot more words. There's no way around that. Cool. All right. Well then, I guess for me, let's talk a little bit about, when we say metrics, what do we really mean? Like, what are the kinds of things that are sort of metrics worthy? What kind of things, like if you were to like just talk to somebody and say, hey, I don't even know where metrics should go in my system, what are the kinds of I'm not looking again for an individual metric, but what are the areas, maybe that's the better word to use here, of the system that you think are like sort of good candidates for this? If you were just, obviously with a specific system, we target something maybe based on something in that domain, but coming up a level from that, what are some of the good candidates you can think of?
Yeah, so just diving into some of the general categories, I think there's a few different buckets you could think about, and they to some extent align with their business areas too, right? So you sort of have your project metrics that describe how your project is doing and how you track the experience of your tenants and how that changes over time. And to a certain extent, there's your development process metrics as well, right? So if you wanted to think of a category of things that are sort of outside of your project and your actual production environment, but you really want to trace back to in a SaaS solution, I want to be thinking about, how are we actually tracking our release experience? How are we tracking bugs? How are we tracking all of those things together so that we can correlate one to another? And of course, then sort of the product areas as well. So, what do we think about the attributes of our product and the reliability and how that product actually performs, from purely an engineering perspective? This goes maybe more toward an infrastructure type of thought, whereas the other is a development process. This is more of an infrastructure process. How do we think about how we're doing over time? How's our quality? How's our reliability? And when, tying those two things together, when our development process introduces a new variable, how do our product metrics sort of fall out of that? How do the changes of those, how are those reflected, and what do we see during those intersections?
It's interesting that I think you hit on a couple things there that I want to drill into maybe a little more, which is you talked about the developer sort of side of the house and then the reliability of the system. And you could say, well, those are things I would track even if I weren't in a SaaS environment. But I think there's a SaaS nuance to those things, right? Which is to say, when let's just look at deployment, for example, right? I've built deployment automation. I've built all of these bits in here. But in a SaaS environment, knowing how successful a deployment is, how frequently do those deployments fail, how quick are we to resolve a failure when it does happen? Those are all things that you could say I would track in any environment. I would just say that in a SaaS environment, the cost of not having that data to me is way higher, right? Like I need to know that, because if I don't, I literally could be impacting the business in a way that has a substantial impact, versus if I've got one-off customers and I'm deploying them onesie twosie here and there, and one of them happens to fail, it's a bad thing, but the scale of the badness of that is there. So for me, those classic life cycle and deployment and sort of that bridge between the developer and the deployment, and like how does that stuff all land, is to me like we often talk about how do I measure the agility of my environment, right? And some of it's baked into that, right? Because people will say I want to be more agile because I'm going to be SaaS, but how do I measure that? Well, some of it's what you're talking about measuring right there, because if we're really good at rolling out a feature fast, but also responding and reacting when something's wrong with that feature, to me that's a measure of like we've done a good job, like we can, versus we're down for like 6 hours because we're figuring it out and so on.
Well, I think on that, to that point, having the ability to kind of see how your infrastructure is filling up, let's say on a portion per tenant, right? Being able to see like when you roll out a feature, because maybe you want that feature to only hit a certain number of tenants or like, but being able to project that kind of that data into your overall kind of metric landscape to figure out, okay, I've released it to these guys. Let me get a view, or let me take that holistic view that might be everybody and filter it to just that subset and see how it responds to those changes. Being able to kind of see that holistically, right? Being able to see, is this providing a good experience for these guys who might be having the feature, but then there's somebody that's co-located with them that doesn't have the feature that's getting kind of squeezed out as a result or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it. It's probably I need a better analogy, but like I think of this of a SaaS environment. Like here's this big pool where all my customers are running. Maybe some are sharing infrastructure, some are not. But this is my entire environment for my business. And every time I launch something into that, another ship into the water or whatever you want to do, anytime I do something to disturb the water there, I want to be very thoughtful about it. And I want to have really good data around what that thing is I just did, how it's affecting everybody else in that environment. Because if I don't have that, I've worked in those SaaS companies where we didn't have that, and we were just super reactive, and it was fire drill all the time, and we were always terrified, in fact, of pushing something out there because we were always worried that something was there. And so for me, the metrics become this enabling mechanism that really say, oh, this is how we know we've done a good job, because we have such a good view into what's happening, and that we're not afraid to sort of push lots of things out there, because if something's wrong, we'll know it, and we'll likely know it before a customer knows it. So I think that experimentation maybe that you're sort of getting at, Toby, is that kind of where you're at there?
Well, yeah, that I think, that kind of dovetails into the DevOps discussion, right? Like there was a cultural shift between, release every 3 months and just, then you push the button to kind of deploy it. Everybody's holding their breath because they're waiting for, the first big error or whatever, versus you get a team like Netflix or even AWS that's releasing, multiple times a day. Like that's a big shift, right? And it's kind of informed and supported by this warm fuzzy. You might even draw a metaphor between like test-driven development, right? Like if I'm writing code and it's surrounded by this suite of tests that gives me the warm fuzzy that it's going to do what I expect it to do, then it's a lot less scary, right? Yeah. Small incremental changes deployed often, you do that enough, and the alarm of it seems to go down. So I think, again, supported by good metrics, supported by a good understanding of what it is that you just did and how that's presenting itself to your customers, and in the wild, is it going to blow up your infrastructure, or is it not? That kind of stuff. Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing.
So let's go a layer beyond this. Let's go to like, hey, I've got a microservice, right? And I've got let's say I've got 5 microservices. And we've given some thought to what the decomposition of those microservices are, what the good boundaries are. Are these good microservices? Are they not good microservices? And we deploy them into our multi-tenant environment, right? And tenants start consuming those microservices. I contend that if I don't have data around how tenants are consuming those microservices, I don't even know whether I've done a great job decomposing them, because I may find that like one microservice has got this huge noisy neighbor problem, and it like the patterns that people are consuming it are different than the way I thought they were consuming it, or maybe the interactions between some of the microservices are way more chatty than I thought they were going to be. And for me, I at least think I want I want to know how tenants and tiers of tenants, that word we aren't really using a lot here, but tier is as important as tenant here in this model. I feel like that data is essential to me to be able to step away and ask questions about, are these microservices, do they need to be rethought? Like, do we need to like reship them, or maybe we need to break them into smaller microservices, or maybe there's 2 microservices that are barely being consumed and I could actually combine them into one. I guess for me, it's like all the way down to that microservice level. I'm looking for data about tenant bits there. I don't know. Do you guys? I guess for me, do you see value in going all the way to that level?
I'll let you go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, sure. No, I would absolutely. This may be my favorite conversation to have with customers about metrics, actually, because when we're talking to a technical audience, it's, generally speaking, microservices aside, microservices are a great example, but our customers always find ways to use our systems that we did not expect. Every system I've ever designed, I spent, weeks, months ideating on specific features and saying, oh yeah, our customer is going to love this. I've talked to some customers, they really want this, and it goes live, and you find those 2 customers who you talk to actually use it, and everyone else goes, that's nice. That really wasn't what we were looking for. We wish you'd go work on this other feature over here. You don't get to talk to 100% of your customers. And if you've got thousands of customers, you don't get to talk to even a percentage of them. The only way for them to communicate back to you is through their use of the system. The only way that matters, perhaps. Mm-hmm. So if you're a development team, why wouldn't you want the feedback of all of your customers in your hands before you set out your next roadmap, before you're saying, okay, we're spending 10% of our time on 10 different features, but all of our customers are spending 80% of this time using this one feature. Well, geez, maybe we should reprioritize a little bit and focus in on this one feature that our customers love. Maybe that's even a product. Maybe we even need to think about how we package these different pieces together. And maybe this is something that's a feature that customers are willing to pay more for separately even. All sorts of thoughts can fall out of that. But if you have 5,000 customers, and we've worked with SaaS providers who have 5,000 customers or more, how do you get feedback from those 5,000 customers and understand what they want out of your solution? Metrics is really the only answer I'm aware of. If people have a better way, then I'd love to hear it. But honestly, it's the only thing that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. I remember reading an article or hearing a podcast or something about, I don't know, this is probably 20 years old now, but remember when Office went from kind of the traditional file, edit, whatever menu bar, and it had a bajillion different options scattered through probably five or 6 menus, each of which had several nesting, and they kind of boiled that down into that what was the ribbon, and it was kind of the new user experience for Office. They had done some research, and I don't think they had done a whole lot prior to that, but to your point, they'd done a research of the bajillions features that we have in Word, let's say 5 were used 99% of the time. And so that informed the kind of distillation of all of those different menu options into what is now the ribbon.
Nice.
That's pervasive through Microsoft product.
And I would say after that, every application that was built had a ribbon in it now. For the next 5 years.
Yeah.
Even if it didn't need one, it had a ribbon.
But the key point being that, you know, like to Bill's point, like, how do you know what those are if you're not instrumenting it in some way? And I guess, you know, maybe that begs the question, what's telemetry versus metrics, right? Are they the same? And I'll throw that back to you, Todd. Moderate us into that question.
Yeah, well, telemetry and metrics. I guess for me, it's I think that it depends on the context and you're talking about them. Some people would put all this data into telemetry or observability. For me, I guess for me, the key is I don't care what you label it. I just know that I want data that's actionable for me, that is it has some quantifiable sort of measure of how something's working or scaling or something else, right? So I'm not really just trying to like plot your path and say you went from X to Y to here, and I have this sort of tea leaves of what you did. I want to somehow bring that together into actionable metrics that tell me, like, do I need to change something about my architecture or my design or something of that nature? I think that's entirely my own definition. It's not an industry definition, but I think of telemetry as like I'm sort of just monitoring the activity of something and watching it on a radar versus sort of that. But in reality, telemetry is often used for metric solutions, so it gets all blurry to me. And I'm certain somebody will say, like the open telemetry world would probably say to me, that's all the same thing. Metrics are just part of telemetry universe. So I do want to go back though, and we were talking about areas to go after, and one other area I guess I do want to think about is we traditionally, just building systems, will look for bottlenecks. We'll say, hey, like in your architecture, like you're ingesting IoT events, or you've got like you're doing some big media function, and you know it's got this like big sort of bulky thing that it's doing, and then you have these operations that are highly used operations in your application. I feel like in multi-tenant environments, I don't always know what those are. I mean, I can hand pick some that I think are going to be the bottlenecks of my system, but sometimes depending on the profile and the personas that are consuming my system, are people consuming it in ways I didn't expect. I've had people like consume parts of my system in ways I didn't introduce any kind of throttling mechanisms or anything else because I thought this part of the system will never get used very heavily. And suddenly I find somebody's consuming it and creating a bottleneck where there wasn't one before. So I guess for me, I feel like in a multi-tenant environment, you can certainly project where some of those optimizations will be needed based on bottlenecks. But in reality, a lot of the time, you're going to get the metrics that from the data, from how people are using the system, and then react to that and introduce optimizations and react to the data from those metrics to decide how and where you might need to do something that optimizes an experience that you didn't expect to optimize at all. And I don't know how you do that without metrics, because I guess I could say some resource is just getting hammered and just say, go add more of that resource, or go put a cache out there, or go do something to try to make it perform better. But how do I know what optimization is the right optimization? Maybe it's really that the basic tier tenant is consuming it in a way that is different than I'm anticipating versus the premium tier tenant. And if I have all the metrics that tell me how those tiers are consuming it, I might be able to introduce a throttling or some other kind of strategy that will still let me get good efficiency out of my infrastructure, but not require me to go build some exotic, maybe more expensive optimization around that. So I guess for me, it's the classic sort of bottleneck story that we do in any architecture extended to this multi-tenant sort of universe. How about any other areas before we move on here that are like classic areas you'd look at that are areas that are rich for metrics?
I think it's all the same. I think, you know, the metrics that you'd collect for scale or for anything else, right? Like what, when do I add more nodes to my cluster, or when do I add more EC2 instances to my scaling group, or whatever? All of those are obviously at play here. I think the dimension that SaaS brings to the table is that you want to maybe add like the tenant context there, so kind of the totality of your infrastructure. This tenant may be responsible for some portion of it, right? That apportionment kind of dimension of it.
Yeah.
But I think in general, it's the same type of metrics that you'd be collecting even if it weren't a SaaS application. SaaS just kind of adds that extra attribution element to it. That's very important for all the reasons we've been talking about.
I want to say, Todd, I don't think any of us have said the word single pane of glass yet. So it might be a record. We've
gotten this far without saying single pane of glass.
I don't believe it. So I'm going to say it. I'm going to say single pane of glass. I'm going to throw it out. It's something we say all the time in our analytics conversations. And going to what Toby just said, really, there's not that much different about SaaS versus a scale, B2C operation or whatever, where you're having to really, scale up and down a lot and have a lot of variable traffic. The big difference with SaaS is those tenants could potentially be distributed across any number of systems. Even if you are in a completely shared solution, you may have 10 different production accounts where those different, shared solutions are running because you're running in different regions, or you needed to shard those out for quotas, or for whatever other reason you decided to shard those customers across accounts. But if you're the guy at the end of the day who has to track, the time to response and, track issues as they come up for specific tenants or globally, you need a single pane of glass. You need some place where you can look and get a very high level picture of the experience of all of your tenants in your applications, and then also be able to drill down into that and say, look, I can see a lot of our premium tier tenants are having a problem. I can tie that back. We did a release yesterday. We added this feature. Maybe there's a correlation there. And now I can dig into those features and say, okay, I can see there's a lot of errors coming on this one specific thing. And I'm seeing some comments here about a Grafana dashboard. That is one of the most common implementations we would see, obviously. That picture it like a Grafana dashboard, if you will, right? This is your SaaS admin dashboard, where you'd go in and be able to see all of these things at a glance, and then quickly dive into those without having to go to another AWS account and log in and look and go through some logs. That's not a performance that will sustain that's not an activity that will sustain the performance your customers need in a SaaS application.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I'll get on my soapbox for a little moment here, just because this is a subject that's sort of near and dear to my heart, which is like, I can't imagine being at a SaaS company and not having, like, yes, you're going to have tooling that is operational tooling, and you're going to have all kinds of awesome mechanisms that give you some ability to like troubleshoot and analyze what's going on in your system. But typically a good SaaS environment's going to have some dashboard that is a tenant aware dashboard, right? It's going to tell me specifically, I'm going to build the views of that system that are my views that tell me how tenants are consuming the system. How can I troubleshoot something quickly? How can I get down to the tier level, like you're saying, Bill, down to the tenant level? The example I always say to somebody is, hey, I look at my dashboard, everything's green, but a customer just called and they said they're having a really bad experience. Like, okay, what tool do I have to go figure out why that tenant is having a bad experience? And if I can't drill into the context of that one tenant and see what's going on, I have no ability to figure out what's going wrong for them, right? So for me, this is why we talk about instrumenting logs with tenant data and tier context, and then instrumenting metrics with all this tenant and tier context. And then the payoff is the pane of glass you're talking, which is that sort of finger on the pulse of what's going on, and that ability to slice and dice it and look at it there. And honestly, I really like to see, there's so many good tools out there. Grafana is a great one. Like, the tooling isn't the problem here. The problem is often having the data there, right? And honestly, even though I said we're not going to connect to the business side of that, a lot of this technical data you're going to use to drive your architecture and your design, it will ultimately have value to the business, because somebody on the product side might be saying, I'm interested in how people use this feature and function, and I want to actually know that, hey, they're not using this function because the system's performance degrades in a certain way at the same time they're consuming that function. Oh, there's some problem here, right? And so I can make business decisions based on that. So even though it may not be my intent when I put the metrics out there to support this business sort of connection, it usually ends up being a great side effect of that. Yeah. Cool. So I guess for me, and I don't even know the answer to this. The answer to this may be nothing, and this will be a really rotten question, and you guys can just tell me next, please. But would the need for metrics fundamentally change any way you would approach how you'd architect the system? Or no, I'm just architect the system, and yes, we'll instrument for metrics. That's an important thing, but I'm not going to do anything different about my architecture because it needs these metrics. I'm just trying to figure out if there's anything. I don't even know for myself the answer to that question. So that's why it's probably a really rotten question. But I'm curious, anything in your guys' mind think that you would somehow just do differently, like your architecture would somehow be different because you knew you needed this metrics insight?
I'll let you answer, Bill.
Oh,
yeah,
and then I'll chime in.
Hunt to Bill. Okay.
Yeah. I have a thought on that, and this is one I've been sort of kicking around in my head for a while. Maybe not fully baked, but I talk to startups a lot, as you guys know. When we talk to startups, there's a lot of conversation about what's the fastest way to get your product to market, but still to sort of lay the groundwork for being able to produce a fully functional SaaS solution at the end of the day. And no one expects an early stage startup to go out and build all of the nice parts of a SaaS solution. They'll probably be out of business long before they ever launch their product. And we always preach MVP, like get something out that's viable, get it in front of customers, validate that product market fit. Then you can start to scale out and grow your product and build all of the bells and whistles around it after you've sort of proved it works. So that said, as you're thinking about your architecture, if I'm talking to a startup and saying, listen, you're going to build a silo product. We're not going to talk about anything pooled yet. Everything's going to be really simplistic. How would we possibly architect so that they could still gain some visibility? And this is something, Todd, I think we've all talked about to some extent before, which is having some single proxy or choke point in that system where all of your traffic passes through. Even if maybe that isn't the optimal way for you to design your system out of the gate, would provide you a lot of visibility for metrics. And again, I mean, if I'm mostly talking about like an API gateway, if your solution didn't have any place for an API gateway, then I wouldn't tell you to go put one in. But there usually is some point in your traffic, right? A load balancer or Kafka or something in your solution that most of the traffic or a lot of the traffic passes through. And I could just put something on there and it says, hey, X got called 1,000 times, Y got called 10,000 times, and get some very coarse-grained metrics. And if I have the opportunity to tell them to do something like that, inject that at some point, I'll definitely take advantage of it and let them start to gather metrics with just the built-in tools that are there, or Kong. I see a comment about Kong in the comments. Some very simple system that lets you emit metrics. You may not get what you want out of it, but if you start there, you're more likely to evolve from there. And I have seen startups fail to start gathering metrics and therefore fail to evolve on gathering metrics.
Yeah, that's good insight. I think to some extent it depends on your stack, right? I think that the Kubernetes or maybe even the containers world, but specifically Kubernetes EKS has an answer to some extent for this, right? Any of the service mesh type stuff, any of the Envoy proxies where they're sitting beside your container and can just be, like you said, instead of a single point, it's that fabric that just lays over top of everything that can tap into whatever and just ship it. It's the 12-factor app kind of stuff, right? Just shipped off everything as it's happening because it's just sharing the same network with all the containers that are in there. So I think that's cool. Kong, having its, I forgot the name of their mesh, but it's a Kumu or something like that, but they've got the same kind of thing going on. So I think, the story there is probably a little more baked. If you were just dealing with, I'm thinking back to years past when before I was even in the Kubernetes ecosystem, how we would have handled this. And it was, we had VMs of some kind, and then how are you dishing that off? And I think we were using a lot of third-party type libraries to just take standard out and aggregate it. But then you're careful to try to how do you format those messages in such a way that they actually make sense downstream, that you could get intelligence out of it, and it's not just a ton of data that offers no insight. Splunk and Datadog, and I think we're going to talk about that later, but has some play there as well.
Yeah, I like where you took that, Bill, and I think you gave a home to this question, which is that maybe at a minimum, maybe I'm not designing an entirely different architecture, but at a minimum, I might be saying, where are there opportunities for me to instrument for observability in a way that is low friction, that would at least give me, no matter what, some sort of baseline view into what's going on, and a natural point to do that that's a low friction, low investment area that would say, no matter, and I've got that view. I would even say, like Toby, you outlined containers kind of things. I can think of lots of equivalents across lots of stacks and technology. Serverless, I could say use extensions as a way to intercept, or I could talk about language stacks, right? Like aspects or something, right? It's the spirit of all this is to say, is there somewhere in your architecture or your implementation where you could capture meaningful and useful data? And what could you do maybe more overtly from the beginning of your system to rely on, to introduce those things, and then also introduce the metrics gathering of those? Because at a minimum, that sort of starts the wheel in motion. And my theory is the more people get exposed to the value of the metrics, the more they want more metrics. And so that suddenly the desire to and the effort associated with metrics demonstrates enough value that people are compelled to add more of them. So for me, if you can start that flywheel kind of going, it tends to get momentum on its own. So I think that's a good thought. Now, like you were also talking about this, like Datadog and Splunk and others, right? I think the next sort of area I kind of wanted to get to was, we've said single pane of glass. Obviously, you can go with Grafana, and you could go use the Elk stack. You could go lots of sort of good sort of dashboardy analytics kind of tools here. But they're also partner, and they're sort of out of the box tools here. And I guess, I think the partners solutions that are out there for AWS, there's a pretty rich sort of community of solutions that are available there. But have you used, I don't know, have you seen these sort of plugged into this pane of glass discussion somewhere? Or they kind of sit on the side of that and you build your own pane of glass? Where do you think these fit?
I think it's all of the above, right? I think there's different things you can do with these different solutions. And just a little aside, just talking about some of those partners that you mentioned, they're often very eager and willing to get startups onto their platforms, right? So they'll, as you get into AWS, you'll find Activate and other programs for startups that those partners will give you significant discounts and incentives to start using their program. In part because once you pick a metrics and analytics platform, you're very likely to stay on it. It's a very powerful tool that New Relic and Datadog and Splunk and all of these partners are offering that come just with a lot of neat functionality baked into them. The ability to create dashboards, to create different panes of glass to view data through, to aggregate both logs and metrics and traceability all into one location is part of the value prop of these modern traceability, modern platform systems, right? They're not really just, Splunk started off as sort of a log aggregator, but now it's evolved and they bought a metrics provider, metrics and analytics provider and some other things. And all of these guys have all of the pieces. So I think, just going back to your question, Todd, you absolutely could use a partner and probably do everything you could think of doing yourself, right? But there's, it's a trade-off, right? I mean, if you get into these, you might find it to be over time, one of your bigger expenses. But that said, with all of these third-party solutions, decide, do you want to be in the business of building metrics and analytics solutions, or do you want to be in the business of building the business you're trying to build, and then decide whether the price is worth it? Because I find I've used Datadog in past lives, I've used Splunk in past lives. The features are really compelling and would be very challenging to build on your own. Even if you build on something like Prometheus and Grafana or the Elk stack, you're still going to spend a lot of time building dashboards and trying to do those things as well. So,
yeah, I think the and this is where I just don't think I know those tools as well as I used to. Like, there's a point at which I knew Datadog pretty well, AppDynamics. There's just a really rich list of them out there. And what we've tried to see is, do they let you sort of slice by tenant and tier? And can you sort of inject that context into their environment? Because obviously they have all this goodness that's already there. So if you can somehow connect this more granular view of the data to their experience, then you sort of get and assuming they sort of give you the ability to either customize or define sort of the graphs and the views that you'd want in that environment, then to me, that's like the best of both worlds, because I've had to invest less to get it there, and the things I can analyze in that scope are not just the things I put there, but the things that partner tool or that custom third-party tool is also ingesting and bringing in all on its own. So I think that's super powerful. I think for me, I'd like to go away and look at those in a little more detail and try to figure out, could they just be the home to that dashboard? But even if they're not, they're always going to play a huge part in your system. It's just a matter of whether or not they're sitting alongside your Grafana dashboard, or whether or not they are the dashboard that you're using. So I think it is interesting because they get into the cost sort of universe sometimes as well. So sometimes you can say this can start to be like Cloud Zero does some interesting things here, where they if I start instrumenting data and putting metrics out there, we can start also seeing like how can we affiliate consumption of a resource with individual tenants. So obviously, we say all the time in SaaS environments, you want to be focused on your IP. You don't want to be building all these tools yourself. Like, you want to be about making your customers happy. So if one of these tools can do the trick for you, by all means, like, you should be looking at it.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna basically tack onto that. It's like we talked more about the operational aspects of metrics and kind of making sure that that you've got the all in place to support your system. But then the other dimension of that we haven't really touched on is how do you price it? How do you know that you're actually making money if you've got a free tier that's gobbling up all of your margin, right?
Yeah, that's that cost per tenant is an area we've talked about a ton. I've sort of avoided it here, but it is obviously very much rooted in this metrics sort of universe as well, because a lot of the data you're trying to get here is there. I think the harder part of the cost per tenant story is, I don't want to know just what happened and how many times it happened. I want to attribute some amount of consumption to the tenant for that action as well, and that's where things get a little more interesting. Probably a whole show we should do on its own,
for sure.
As we sort of look for ways to do that. I do want to throw a little bit of a curveball in here though, which is we're obviously we're the three of us are inside of the AWS stack all day long, and certainly AWS on its own has a pretty rich set of sort of analytics and warehousing and sort of tools around this, right? QuickSight and Redshift and OpenSearch and all these different sort of Kinesis, right? If I want to sort of build this on the AWS stack, is there a preferred stack, and how do I deal with things like CloudWatch metrics and all these other metrics that are already sort of part of the stack as well? Am I pulling the data from them and aggregating them into some repository that's my own? Or I guess that's a wide open question of, is there a specific tool chain that's a great fit here if I were just building my own sort of bits on the AWS stack?
If you're EKS, we've got Managed Grafana and Prometheus, right? So that's a good starting point. And then a lot of stuff, there's this, Zeppelin was mentioned. There's a ton of stuff that Prometheus can feed that are good in that ecosystem. So that's a
yeah, maybe I should have qualified that a little more, Toby, which is, yeah, I think you're going to land in one of those environments, but somewhere you're publishing those metrics to something's ingesting them and they're delivering them to somewhere. And there's often glue that sits in the middle of all that. Are there AWS sort of mechanisms, right? Could I be using with Kinesis? I mentioned, should I use Kinesis and like ingest my metric of Kinesis? Could I just do SQS events? Like what Event Bridge, right? Like there's a pretty long list of mechanisms here. And I don't know that I would say any one of them to me stands out as the solution to this problem, right? I can also publish all this through CloudWatch, right? I could do custom events and do everything through CloudWatch if I wanted. I'm just curious if you guys tend to lean in any particular direction there.
I think the challenge sorry, Bill. I think the challenge, we've talked a lot about a lot of different tools. And so far, I don't know that we would have, given the spectrum of stuff that we've talked about, a single place in which we could kind of aggregate all that, unless maybe it was a custom kind of quick site dashboard or something like that was feeding off all the other stuff. So, if we really truly wanted to get to a single pane of glass, I think that you'd probably do something like CloudWatch, because that is pretty pervasive, obviously, through all of the AWS services. But that would be a good that would, on the AWS stack, that would be a good place to start, in my opinion. That's probably what I would advise a customer.
Yeah, it's a good thing I let you go first, Toby, because I was probably going to say about a lot of the same stuff you did. So CloudWatch is a good starting point. There's a new feature that I'm not entirely sure if it's GA yet of CloudWatch log aggregation. That ProServe did an implementation for one of my customers recently. So that, I think, is very promising overall. Just the concept of aggregation of how do you take, in a multi-account strategy, how do you take all of the different logs and all of the different metrics from all these different disparate locations, pull them into one spot, and what you do with them from there is kind of an arbitrary question to me. It really depends on what you want to do with that data at the end of the day. You could easily shove it off into the Elk stack if log searching is what you want to do. If you're just trying to get to the metrics, you could visualize them directly out of there with built-in CloudWatch tools, or you could send them off to Grafana or whatever you like on that front. But really, it's a two-part problem, right? How do you get everything in one spot so you can add a single pane of glass on top of it? And then perhaps like CloudWatch has, fairly easily baked in, integration with Kinesis to pipe things downstream. You say, well, I get it into CloudWatch from there. I can get it into Kinesis and it can land pretty much anywhere. Those third parties we were just talking about, internal tools, whatever it is. But to me, that's one of the keys. That initial aggregation is the first part of that conversation. CloudWatch seems like, for maybe with the exception of EKS where you have a little more flexibility, but it seems like that's maybe the common element for most solutions that I've seen. It's going to land in CloudWatch first and then land somewhere else later potentially. But if I was starting out, again, going back to the startup conversation or the greenfield conversation, maybe start there and then see what else comes along for you.
Yeah, and for me, it's always a hard one because the sort of collection of options you have here is so big and so long, and then there are so many what if questions. How long are you going to keep the data? How important is cost to you? Like, what patterns are you going to consume it in? And so I always end up with this sort of let's figure out what you really need kind of answer to that question. But for me, the reality is, if you could do something low friction and it sort of meets your cost parameters, whatever that is, like, by all means do that. And this even wanders back to like these out of the box solutions. If one of those can be that, that's awesome too, because like they wire into CloudWatch and all the other AWS constructs as well, and they can be consumers of that as well. But I do think you've said, and I know I've advocated this quite a bit. Ultimately, this broader metric story is we're trying to put all of these metrics one place if we can, because the reality is, like, all the other metrics we're not talking about, they're going to go there as well. All those business metrics are going to go there, and we're really trying to land them all there and then say, let the different personas in the business, the technical and the non-technical, figure out what view of it is meaningful to them. And you might have 4 panes of glass across 4 different roles in an organization who are extracting different value out of that data. That's my dream world. But I would love to say that we get that a lot. But maybe that transitions me to my next question, which is the challenge of this discussion is I can sit in a room with a group of people. I can sit with another SaaS company and talk about the value of these metrics, and everybody nods their heads. Everybody says this is a great idea. But the reality is, based on the, and I've been that guy at the table who has to still go back and get features and functions to work, or get basic things to work. This doesn't often make its way to the top of the backlog. So teams will achieve some level of metrics and analytics, but they won't necessarily get the really rich view that we're talking about here. They won't really invest in it so heavily. And so we end up in this sort of motion where they're like, we think we'd get value out of it, but we can't sort of make the time to give it high enough priority. And I don't know if there's some magic to that or not, but I guess maybe I'll start with, do you guys see that trend across? Maybe I'll go to you, Bill, first. Do you see that same sort of pattern in some of the customers you work with?
For sure. Yeah, it's surprising sometimes. I've mentioned I work with startups a lot, and you'd say, oh, well, you work with startups a lot. So, of course, startups maybe haven't gotten to metrics because they're, focused on product market fit. I've worked with, extremely large customers as well, who have mature products and minimal visibility into the operational aspects of those products along any of the matrices we've been talking about today, about development, about the infrastructure and monitoring your infrastructure, and your product and the maturity of your product. And you get it, like you said, Todd. I mean, you understand where they're coming from. People are focused on features, and it's sometimes it's a very hard sell. They understand it. It's not like you're speaking Greek and they're like, I don't get what you're talking about. They see the value of it, but it's hard to come around on. It's hard to arrive at, and it's not an insignificant lift. Especially if you have a mature product. I often hear a lot of hesitation to go back and revisit any of the existing stuff, or maybe even an inability to. Hey, I can't change my code. No one wants to touch this behemoth that we wrote. So we're just sort of putting a wrapper around it, and then you try to say, well, put some stuff into the wrapper. Like don't just forget everything. Like don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But surprisingly, I think I maybe talked to 60 or 70 customers last year. A lot of those customers, maybe even approaching half, had very minimal to no coverage in terms of anything other than operational metrics that came out of their compute or their databases. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, for me, it's like if you go to the really sort of big, successful, large scale SaaS companies and you look at what they're doing, the metrics are like the lifeblood of their business, right? And you tell that to the folks that maybe aren't all the way there yet. And I think it's almost like they're waiting for the pain of not having them before they make them a priority for their business. And that's probably human nature to do that. I will say that the two things I would advocate is, if I'm the architect in that room and I want the metrics, which is something that has to be the first step in this process, which is I want them because they're useful to me. At least let me get my technical metrics in. I'm going to go to my product manager, my product owner. I'm going to try to sell the business on why those things are as important or more important than maybe some of the features and function in the backlog. If I'm talking to the product owner in that scenario, I'm going to say, hey, product owner, you need to think about these operational attributes and the value of metrics alongside the other bits in your backlog, because sometimes they're not even in the product owner's view. And I try on those two fronts. I just don't know that I always succeed. So I just keep sort of, part of why we're having this entire episode on this topic is because I would love to see more people make this a higher priority in their environments. And I genuinely believe it will make a difference in the quality and the efficiency and the sort of availability of their environments. But at this point, I feel like it's probably a soapboxy sort of moment more than anything else.
I think it boils, it's not a problem unique to the cloud space, but it certainly took on a new face, right, when in the cloud world and in distributed computing. I think just in general. So I think it's like a lot of the stuff that we see that lags or seemingly lags in our world. You know, the hesitation to do DevOps, right? Like the one release per 3 months. I think it's born from the same culture, you know. And so breaking through that is just part of the challenge.
Yeah, that's cool. Now, so one last little caveat I want to look at before we wrap things up here is, if we sort of, obviously we see AI ML as a discipline just showing up across all kinds of experience and expanding its reach into places probably we didn't expect it to be in before. And we see people applying it in interesting ways in their environments. So I sort of wondered, assuming we're the place that has gone all in with metrics, and we're like, we've got really rich metrics, we've got all these really interesting data. Is there value in starting to try to sort of mine that data and with ML or whatever, and start trying to do predictive things about that data that maybe just a human eye won't catch, or the sort of basic human analysis of that data won't find, but maybe some sort of ML or and again, I don't have a specific pattern or a path that I'm looking for here, as much as is it a reasonable to expect that maybe AI ML will end up getting applied to this problem domain?
It seems inevitable to me. I think maybe AI ML in everything is inevitable at this point, as far as I can grok. I mean, I'm certainly not all knowing on this, and maybe we're all wrong, and AI ML is not where everything's going. But just thinking about the actual, as opposed to the partners we're helping to build out, I mean, look at the products that are out there. The analytics space and downstream partners adding AI ML to the analytics streams and trying to derive insights, faster than humans possibly could out of data is an exploding space. We're seeing tons of companies in that space. So you got to ask yourself, if they're capable of doing it with their data, it seems like there'd be an obvious opportunity for you to do it with yours. And it may not be the easiest lift. It's not like you could jump into AI ML and just start working with it, but you've got the data in hand. A lot of the AI ML challenge is having good data to work off of, and then you have to build your models off of those. So if you've got that data, taking some time, maybe even just working with a partner who's AI ML enabled to build out some models and get some inference out of those, it seems just really obvious. Again, talking about that partner who has 5,000 customers. How on earth could you possibly be analyzing those all the time as a human being, even if you built the best dashboard on earth? You may not catch any number of things that are going on that may lead to actionable intelligence about your customers, about your systems, about your development processes. So absolutely. I mean, it's a huge opportunity. I think it's a little greenfield in that you'll probably be inventing a little, some wheels that other people are inventing at the same time.
Yeah.
It's an amazing opportunity.
And I see some traction here in this space a little bit around people trying to find tooling that will start to do more meaningful things with logs, et cetera. But I do think the caveat you added there, which is if I have, a huge population of tenants, right? If I've got 5,000 tenants or I've got 10,000 tenants, there are clearly things probably going on in my system that there's no way I'm aware of that are going on, that are trends or patterns that are probably meaningful in my business, and I'm just not going to find them on my own. So I think there's work. I think it is, like you said, greenfield, but I think it is an interesting area to explore. Anyway, I know we're getting up on time here. I know this wasn't like an in the weeds kind of discussion of a bunch of code, and I definitely like those kinds of conversations. But I also feel like if you're going to be a SaaS architect and we're going to be talking about technical topics here, we have to at some point at least sort of throw down the metrics gauntlet and say, please, make this part of your experience, invest here. There's a lot of value to be had here. But anyway, I really appreciate you joining in for the show here. Thanks, Bill and Toby, for being part of the conversation. And we'll look forward to having you be part of our next episode. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Todd.